Alex Michealides is the king of psychological thrillers, and this book is no exception. I particularly like how this book plays with the tropes of mystery novels. It's difficult to write a unique thriller, but Michealides manages to surprise me more and more with every book. So let's dive into the plot, characterization, and themes in The Fury. The plot of this book was very interesting. The narrator, Elliot, starts off by explaining that this is not your typical whodunit. He alludes to Agatha Christie at least one or two times throughout the book and keeps telling us this is not normal. And yet, the book follows all the typical tropes of a whodunit. That is until about halfway through the book, when we start over. So let's look at the exposition. What do we know at the beginning of the novel? In the exposition, the narrator sets the scene by introducing us to the island and the fates, and it's a beautiful ode to the classics. Elliot also sets the stage by telling us this is not going to be normal. We know that this is a different sort of tale. This book is written in second person, which is an interesting way to approach a thriller. It puts us in the story with him. However, as we continue with the novel, it's unclear if he's talking to us as a you or if there's somebody in particular. Throughout the novel, Elliot leads us to what we think is the climax of the novel, but then we backtrack to the past. It starts by backtracking a few days, then a few weeks, and then we back all the way up to Elliot's childhood. Instead of being like detectives in the novel, we are more like Elliot's psychologists, unburying the things that he isn't telling us. Was I the only one curious how he knew everyone's thoughts and secrets during this first book? I was so confused how he knew about Jason's business, or how Kate was doing a line of cocaine, when he wasn't there for any of that. However, as you peel back the layers, it's clear why Elliot thought he knew everyone, and it was because he thought he was the mastermind of the whole plan, until everything backfired. He also kept saying, "This is where I knew everything went wrong," but he just kept pushing through until the end. I'm not going to lie. I was a bit annoyed by the cyclical nature of this book. There are only so many times I want to rehash events that already happened through a new lens. However, all the bits and pieces that lead to the climax are very exciting. I think learning about Elliot's past and where he came from made the whole tale make more sense. And it made the ending make sense as well. The climax of this novel is Elliot's meltdown and the ending of Lana's life. I thought that this was very well done. Elliot taking the fury into himself and going mad brought the symbols and the themes together. Also, when Lana betrays him and everyone gangs up on him, it's like he was a kid all over again. And since he had such a terrible childhood, he's finally lashing out against the person he loved the most. Honestly, after what happened to Elliot on the beach, I wasn't sure that anyone was going to get murdered. And then he shoots Lana. I honestly didn't see that coming. Not with how much Elliot loved Lana. Did you see it coming? He does refer to her in the past, but we will talk a little bit more about this later. So let's unpack the resolution of the book. For me, the book left me with more questions than I have answered. So here were some of my questions I had at the end and my thoughts. Question number 1. Who is Elliot talking to? Were we the audience, or was it someone else? Now, I think this is one of the big ideas that this book takes on. I believe that Elliot was talking to his inner child. At the very end of the book, he talks about taking his inner child out and setting it on his bed next to him, and then telling him a story. So it makes sense that this is the story he was telling. He also keeps saying, you being the audience member, are just sitting there and listening. So was it his younger self, or was it us? It makes sense that he wasn't talking to us, but to himself. Now, instead of lying to himself about what happened, we see him embrace his whole self. Instead of the lies he's been telling to himself, maybe he's able to finally grow up at the end of this book, at the age of 40. Question 2. What do you think the ending of the book meant? Why do you think Michealides chose to end it like this? Because this book wasn't your typical whodunit. I think the ending of the book was a way to set the book apart from other mysteries and thrillers. Michealides reminds me of a modern Edgar Allan Poe. He writes to explore the darker side of people's minds and seeks to explore how crazy people might see the world. I enjoy this lens because it helps me understand how they see the world and how I need to change the way I see the world to avoid stepping into a similar pattern. Number 3. Did Marion say that her friend Theo was in the psych ward now? Is this the same Theo that we saw earlier in the book? Is he out for revenge? Or did I just misunderstand? Did she say Theo? Let me know in the comments below. Question 4. What happened to Kate and Jason? Now I know that they were kind of terrible people, and we shouldn't really care. But I also want to know what happened to Kate and Jason after the island. And question 5. Did Elliot actually kill Barbara West, or do you think it was really an accident? I was actually surprised, but not really surprised, that Elliot didn't write the play. It was, after all, a plagiarism of Barbara West. I guess he felt like he deserved the credit since he took care of her, and she didn't leave him anything else. Those are just a few questions I had by the end of the novel. Did you have any unanswered questions? Make sure to leave them in the comments so we can have a chat about them. Now let's move to characterization. Elliot is such an interesting narrator. From the beginning of the book, we know that we cannot trust him. He starts by talking about how he's not trustworthy because he's part of the story, not the main character, but someone in the story. However, he also talks about being an unreliable narrator. In a monologue, he says, "And before you accuse me of telling my story in a labyrinthian manner, let me remind you this is a true story. And in real life, that's how we all communicate, isn't it? We're all over the place. We jump back and forth in time, slow down and expand on some moments, fast forward through others, editing as we go, minimizing flaws and maximizing assets. We are all the unreliable narrators of our own lives. So we know at the get-go that we can't trust him. However, like in Michealides' other books, Elliot grows on us, or maybe it was just me, and I came to accept his narrative, although it was clearly very biased. The longer we read through the book, the more truth we are able to uncover about Elliot and how his name wasn't actually Elliot at all. In his younger years, Elliot struggled with his home life. We knew from the get-go that his parents paid little to no attention to him, but not only that, he was bullied at school. Elliot didn't have anyone to stand up for him, and he didn't stand up for himself either. Instead, he keeps taking it, hoping one day it will stop. As he grows up, Elliot falls in love with the screen version of Lana, and then finds a way to insert himself into her life. Creepy. He meets Barbara West at a bar, and she takes him under her wing. I'm unsure about their relationship, but it seems like he just moved in with her so she wasn't so lonely. You could take her word for it that she took him under to observe, but honestly, she probably just was a lonely old lady. Elliot grows closer to Lana, and if it weren't for his notebooks and his psychotic ramblings, it seems like she would have fallen for him as well. At least, that's what Elliot wanted us to believe. Elliot is clearly a tortured character. What I found most interesting about Elliot is that he considered himself a playwright, even though he had not successfully written a play. In this book, he's staging his own life. He gives everyone a role, and people play their parts. He dissects his world as if it were a screenplay, telling us about the acts and the rising action as if his whole life was a play. It's an interesting way to view the world, and I enjoyed it. It was interesting being in Elliot's head and seeing the world through his eyes. I feel like we move from Elliot lying to himself to him being able to tell himself the full truth of what happened as the book progresses. Although he felt like it was only worth telling his story to an audience, it's clear that him telling himself this story was the best thing he could do. The rest of the characters in this novel are stock characters for Elliot to take the main stage. It is unclear whether we can trust Elliot's analysis of them, because who knows how much of it he made up for dramatization and how much of it was actually true. So while we can dig into Elliot's characterization, the characterization of the other characters give us more insight into our main character's mind and not really the people and who they were. And that leads us perfectly into themes. The first idea this book covers is that life is all just one big performance. Elliot says, I often think life is just a performance. None of it is real. It's just a pretense at reality. That's all. Only when someone or something we love dies do we wake up from the play and see how artificial it all is, this constructed reality we inhabit. Later he says, the real tragedy is, of course, by always looking outward, by focusing so intently on other people's experiences, we lose touch with our own. It's as if we live our entire lives pretending to be ourselves, as imposters, impersonating ourselves, rather than feeling, this is really me, this is who I am. End quote. Now, while some of our lives might feel like a performance, I think that most of Elliot's life was a construction. He hid his true self from Lana and the rest of the world in order to fit in. He shows the version of himself that he wants people to know. He's not himself, but a fake person. Now, I do not think that there are many people like Elliot in the world, but it's hard to say. With social media and other internet apps, it's easy to create a persona and become someone that we are not. What we learn from Elliot is that keeping that true someone deep down is very dangerous. An interesting symbol in this book was the wind. The wind gives us insight into what's going on in Elliot's mind. Like the wind is used in traditions of Greek stories, the wind showed that something bad was coming. Here's a quote about the wind that ties into this idea that Elliot is constantly staging a play in his mind. We suddenly realize that life is in no way lasting or permanent. No future exists, and nothing we do matters. And in desolation, we howl and scream and rail at the heavens until at some point we do the inevitable. We eat, we dress, and brush our teeth. We continue with our marionette-like motions of life, however unhinged it feels to do so. Then, ever so slowly, the illusion takes over again until we forget that we are actors in a play. Like the wind, he howls and screams and rails. I do love when authors use the setting to help tell the story. And here the narrator knows about the classic tradition and uses it to set his scene. So what can we take from this? I think we find the answer in this short quote. If you're afraid, you can't be authentic. End quote. The next idea this book covers is the idea of an inner child. After going to group therapy, Elliot learns about the idea of an inner child. From Mariana. Here's the direct quote. Trapped here, Mariana tapped the side of her head. A frightened child is hiding in your mind, still unsafe, still unheard and unloved. And the sooner you get in touch with that child and learn to communicate with them, the more harmonious your life will be. I must have looked dubious, because Mariana delivered the killer blow directly to me. After all, that's what he grew you for, isn't it, Elliot? A strong adult body to look after him and his interests, to take care of him, protect him. You were meant to liberate him, but ended up becoming his jailer. End quote. This is an idea that Elliot internalizes and really becomes the main struggle in the book. Elliot feels like he was forever a child, frozen in the moment of when everything bad happened to him. He wasn't really able to grow up and progress emotionally. So he will always be looking for someone to love him unconditionally, like his parents did not. Here's a quote from Elliot about his childhood. "Don't feel bad for me. This isn't a misery memoir, just a simple statement of fact. It's a familiar enough tale, I suspect. Like all too many children, I endured an upbringing characterized by longing periods of abandonment and neglect, both physical and emotional. And the only time my father laid hands on me was in anger. This I find harder to forgive, not the physical violence, you understand, which I soon learned to accept as part of life, but the lack of touch and its repercussions for me later as an adult. How can I put it? It left me unused to, even afraid of, the touch of another, and it has made intimate relationships, emotional or physical, extremely difficult. This difficult child kept him from getting a proper education and a proper understanding of life. I really do feel bad for Elliot. He tried his best to move on from his past, but it kept wiggling out of him like a worm. I guess this is why you shouldn't repress your feelings." Another quote that stood out to me was this: "Once I saw the kid in me, I started seeing kids and other people, all dressed as adults, play acting at being grown up. I saw through performances now to the frightened children beneath. And when you think of someone as a child, it's impossible for you to feel hatred." I really do like this idea that each of us has an inner child. It's similar to the idea that we're all dealing with something that's not always visible. But when you think of everyone having an inner child, it's a nice way of having empathy for them. It's difficult to hate children. They're so young and perfect and innocent. Therefore, if we look for everyone's inner child, we are able to see past the mistakes or choices they've made and see them as a person who's just trying their best, just like you. The last idea that is repeated over and over again in this book is the role between fate and free will. This is a topic that is covered by many classic pieces of literature. We see it in Greek plays, as well as retelling of Greek plays, such as Julius Caesar by William Shakespeare and Percy Jackson. It's a question that haunts many of us. Are we masters of our own fate? Or, like in this book, is fate just a character in our own lives? I'm not sure that this book really answers that question. Was Elliot in control of his own life, or was he doomed to become this person? Great question. He didn't have a great childhood, but many people are able to overcome unhappy childhoods and become high-functioning adults. However, Elliot didn't finish school, and he did questionable things in order to live. But he didn't have to kill Lana. I, for one, believe that we have control of our own fates. Yes, your choices might be terrible, but fate is just a character in our lives. We cannot control what happens to us, but we can control how we respond to it. I think the message that Michealides wanted us to take about fate is that you aren't doomed to be a good person or a bad person. We are all a combination of both. We are our own narrators creating our own stories, yes, and that makes us unreliable unless we tell our stories. We seek to understand our stories in an unbiased light. If we, like Elliot, tell ourselves the truth, then we are able to make fate a character in our own lives instead of letting our fates control our story. Overall, I thought this was an excellent and original novel. Though the book was a bit repetitive, I enjoyed peeling back the layers of this story as we uncovered all of the truth. Instead of the author leading us to the clue, he was leading us through the lies that Elliot had told himself. He was unpeeling the persona that Elliot had created so we can see the real him. It was interesting, exciting, and a little bit creepy. So I hope that you enjoyed reading this one as much as I did. I hope you enjoyed this episode of According to Your English Teacher. I'd love to connect with you on social media, or feel free to send me an email. My email is atyet33@gmail.com, or you can find me on Instagram at According to Your English Teacher. I'd love to hear more of your thoughts on this book or any of the novels you've been reading recently. If you like this episode, please make sure to give it a thumbs up or give the podcast a review. That would mean the world to me. let me leave you with one final quote. But then, if I wasn't the Tin Man, who was I? To my dismay, I realized I must be the Wizard of Oz himself. I was an illusion, a conjuring trick, operated by a frightening man cowering behind a curtain. Who are you, I wonder? Ask yourself this honestly, and you might be surprised at the answer. But will you be honest? That's the real question. This episode was written by me, Sam Gunther, and edited by Down Gunther. The music was produced by Tom Brinton. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and please stay tuned for next week as we dive into The Huntress by Kate Quinn.